Hello everyone, welcome to Hudson Institute Political Studies. My name is Quinn Rifkin. I'm a graduate of Middlebury College and of St. John's College, where I got a master's degree in the liberal arts, and I'm headed to Boston College in the fall to study political philosophy. And I'm joined today by Professor Devin Stauffer, who's been at the University of Texas at Austin for the past 20 years. Before that, he taught at Kenyon and St. John's College. He was an undergraduate at Kenyon and earned his Ph.D. from Boston College. And I'm pleased to be joined by him today.
Thank you, pleasure to be here.
So you just finished up teaching Plato, the third week of the program. We do almost all of the Republic in this week. So I'm wondering, and your dissertation was on Plato, I know. So how did you get interested in Plato? How did you get interested in political philosophy generally?
Well, my path to political philosophy preceded, I think, my path to Plato. I went to Kenyon College and was intending to major in political science and become a journalist or a lawyer or I know not what. I just had the great good fortune of wandering into some terrific classrooms with some great professors of political philosophy there. And then there was a kind of turning point in my life. In my first semester of my junior year, I was off to Africa for a study abroad program. And just by chance, my father asked me if I had any reading for the plane over to Africa. And I said, no. He said, why don't you take this book? It's getting a lot of press these days. And he handed me Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind. And reading that book was a real moment in my life. It changed my life. I had been interested in political philosophy my first 2 years, but that book convinced me that I should take the plunge. And so I when I came back from my trip, which I was very eager to get back and start studying political philosophy, I was a transformed student and threw myself in. And then just another stroke of luck, my senior year at Kenyon, a terrific professor named Christopher Bruhl came to give a lecture that's on YouTube, that you guys can find it on YouTube, called Reading Plato Today. And I was an undergraduate in the audience of that lecture. And I thought, this lecture is Reading Plato Today. I want to go read Plato with him tomorrow. So, so I was very impressed by this lecture. And I decided more or less then and there that I wanted to go study at Boston College. And Christopher Bruhl is a Plato expert. And once I started studying Plato there, just the directness of Plato's questions, I was kind of surprised to find that an ancient author spoke so directly to questions that I had always been questions for me, and questions that I wanted to think about but didn't really know how to think about. And so Plato gave me a pathway into thinking about those questions. And then, so I ended up, one of those questions was the question of justice. And so I wanted to think deeply about that, so I started studying Book One of the Republic in a summer in graduate school. And it just gripped me so much that I decided I'd do my dissertation on that. So that's my pathway in.
Yeah, it's funny how often you hear that it's really the chance encounter with a book or the chance encounter with one professor that really leads one to this kind of path in life.
Yeah, that was certainly true in my case. I mean, I had no idea what would become of my life. I'd probably be a lawyer, I imagine, something like that, which would be fine. But I just happened. It was a combination of books and people. Mm-hmm. And I think in my case it really had to be both. Right. It was the very special teachers, but also the books too, and that conjunction changed my life.
Mm. So we just finished up. The Republic for this week. Book 7 we ended on. Mm-hmm. How did you find the trajectory of teaching Plato over the course of 1 week? It's definitely a lot to take in.
Yes.
There's a certain angle you take with the students.
Yes, it is. Well, not only it's a bit of a challenge because we jump in midstream, and so we jump in as you know, but as the listeners may not. In the third week of the program, we are not starting at the beginning of the Republic. The first book and a half of the Republic, roughly, is in the first week. So I'm picking up a dialogue both in the classroom and in the actual text that's already underway. And so what that means is that the third week goes deep into what's, in a sense, not the whole of the Republic, but the heart of it, the construction of the city and speech in the Republic. And so, and it's a pretty quick tour to go through the entire city of speech in 5 classes, but we do have 3 hours each time, and I think we're able to really dig in to some extent. I mean, we pick our battles, of course, but yeah, I mean, it has a kind of wholeness to it, because even though it doesn't get all the way to the end of the book, it gets through the image of the cave, which is a very powerful image. We talk about that. And then it allows the students to think about, as we did today in class, the purpose of the construction of the entire city and what Plato is aiming at and trying to convey by having Socrates build this city in speech.
Right. So for the students who might not know, can you give a brief outline of the trajectory of what the city in speech is and what Socrates seems to be doing?
Yeah, so it's rather complicated, so I'll try to keep a long story fairly short. Mm-hmm. But the city in speech emerges out of a demand of 2 young brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who want to be shown that justice is good for the individual. Socrates makes a surprising decision in response to that demand, which is not an obvious decision. So the reasons for it are complicated, but he decides to construct an imaginary city in speech. And the behind this thought experiment of sorts is the notion also that the city in speech will provide an image for finding justice in the soul. And what ends up happening is the question of what justice is intersects in very complicated ways with the question of whether justice is good. And to address those questions, Socrates and these young brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, go through the process of founding a city from the ground up, meaning he starts the very, very basic city coming together to meet the most basic of economic needs. And then the city grows and develops over the course of Book 2 and Book 3, where he describes, among other things, a very complicated educational scheme that's for the crucial class of the citizens of the city named the guardians. And so it also becomes a book about education. And then there's a kind of pause of sorts in Book 4, where the city is used to address, they return more directly to the question of justice. They use the city to try to address that question. And there's a kind of resolution at that point to the problem of justice, although in my view it's not a complete resolution. And then there's a resumption of the city, which seemed to be complete at the end of Book 4. They return to it, and Socrates adds on 3, what are called in the text 3 waves. And the 3 waves are sexual equality and occupations, the communism of women and children, which refers to a very bizarre mating scheme in the Republic, which is essentially an attempt to find a way around having nuclear families in the city. And then the ultimate capstone of the city, the rule of philosopher kings. And then once philosopher kings come on the scene, the book turns to a long, deep, interesting discussion of philosophy and its relation to politics, both the tension between philosophy and politics and what it might be, whether it's possible and desirable that philosophy and politics merge in the sense of having philosopher kings rule the city. So there's an awful lot involved in the deconstruction of the city, and it takes a number of turns. But I would say at the heart of the whole thing are 4 basic questions. What is justice? Is justice good in the sense of being good for the individual just person, himself or herself? What is the fundamental nature of politics and political life? And then what is the relationship between philosophy and politics? So I cling to those 4 basic questions to kind of give some sense of order in a very complicated, twisting and turning text.
So Plato's Republic is, I think, the second longest dialogue of Plato's. And he makes it's interesting because he has the 2 main interlocutors be his brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus. And the Republic starts with Socrates walking with Glaucon and not Adeimantus. Mm-hmm. And over the course of the book, you get to see that they have, very different souls or characters. So I'm wondering, what is this difference between the 2, and why is Socrates initially with Glaucon and not Adeimantus?
Yeah, I think it's fair to think that Socrates is more drawn to Glaucon and has more interest in Glaucon. And I'm not sure from the very beginning of the book we get any answer to that. So I think the best way to start thinking about that is to look at the two speeches that the brothers give at the beginning of the second book. It's a very powerful moment of the book where they give these two speeches. And the speeches are very interesting for what they show about justice, but also for revealing the difference in character between the two brothers. And I think I would describe the difference. Glaucon is bolder. Socrates describes him as always most courageous in everything. I would also sort of describe it, I don't actually know which one was the older brother, but I know which one is the older soul, that Adeimantus is the older soul. And Glaucon has he's young at heart, and it means that the question of justice is much more a live question for him in his own life. He has more skin in the game and willing to put more skin in the game than Adeimantus, who likes to sort of stand back and analyze the problem as if it's a problem of how other people are going to be addressed and how other people are going to... And Adeimantus' speech is, among other things, a diagnosis of what is bothering his brother. Whereas Glaucon, I think, is putting his own soul on the line in a more robust way than Adeimantus. And I think Socrates thinks that, therefore, in some ways, Glaucon is the deeper and more interesting of the two brothers.
Do you think it's possible that Socrates saw in Glaucon a potential philosopher, or is it more the case that he has some ancillary interest in Glaucon because of Plato himself? Or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. They were brothers of Plato. I don't know who's older between Glaucon and Adeimantus, but Plato, I gather, was younger than both of them. And he might have thought and by the way, Glaucon may have been in some respect a potential philosopher, but he actually did not turn to philosophy. And interestingly enough, the only character in the book, other than Socrates, of course, who's said to have turned to philosophy is Polemarchus in book 1. And so I think students should keep a close eye on Polemarchus. He's more important than it first seems. And with Glaucon, I think it ends up being the case that as promising and impressive as he is, there was ultimately something about him that was problematic from Socrates' point of view. And I think one of the challenges to find in reading the book is to think about what that might be.
Yeah, I mean, this program is somewhat interesting because we start in a kind of unorthodox way. You begin by reading Machiavelli, who takes shots at this kind of whole enterprise of, imaginary principalities and this building of the ideal regime in speech. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about this break that Machiavelli has with the ancient tradition when it comes to these kind of fundamental questions.
Yeah, certainly, and this is what with the last hour of the seminar this morning, we focused on this difference. So Machiavelli is of great importance for many reasons, but one of them is he initiated a revolution in political philosophy. And he declares this himself. He declares that he's breaking with the orders of others, as he says. And the place where he says this most famously and most importantly is in chapter 15 of The Prince. And he there suggests that he's going to present the effectual truth of politics that will help bring, create the possibility for a ruler who could bring more order than's ever been brought before to the political world by focusing on the harsh realities, the effectual truth of politics, as opposed to getting caught up in utopian fantasies about perfect commonwealths and perfect principalities. And among the imaginary, what he calls them imaginary republics, I believe is his term, and among those, it's not the only one he has in mind, but it may be the chief one he has in mind, is Plato's Republic. So Machiavelli himself sets his enterprise against Plato's, and he claims that he's going to be doing something far more effective and realistic, and that claim and that change transformed the character of political philosophy in modern times. And much of the modern political world has been influenced by that. But and I think the students can, starting with Machiavelli, they can get their minds around that argument, that change, but they don't know the character of the imaginary principalities he's talking about. And so then in the third week, you can go back and get a sense of what that imaginary principality was like, and then try to see, and this is not an easy matter, but I think it's a kind of challenge to think about what Plato might say in response to Machiavelli's criticism that the whole ancient approach to thinking about politics was utopian, unrealistic, ineffective, and maybe even detrimental to political life. And so the Republic, there's not an easy answer to what Plato would say. It's a real challenge. It's not, you can't just simply set, well, here's what Machiavelli says, here's what Plato says. It is rather straightforward what Machiavelli says, but how Plato would respond is a real challenge. And so I think that's one thing students can try to do at the end of the third week of the program, is to think about that difference once they've actually experienced both things, rather than just talking about it right out of the gate.
Right, right. I mean, we ended today in seminar with some reflections on the difference in the education that the Republic provides for a student, and the difference and the education that the Prince provides to students. And it seems, I mean, you get the whole premise of the Republic is in some way that they're building a city in speech to understand the soul in a fundamental way. And you know, the soul is not something you really get in Machiavelli's Prince at all. So I'm wondering, do you have any sense on the difference in the way that these two books are received by the students?
Oh, by the students in the program?
Yeah.
I mean, my sense is that at least some of the students appreciate the fact that Plato opens up more capacious questions that go beyond the harsh necessities of politics and the demands of rule, which Machiavelli brings out and discusses, and which are important and interesting, but there's, I think, a sense among some of the students that there's more to politics and more to life than one can find in Machiavelli's Prince. Not that Machiavelli's wholly wrong or not a deep thinker, but that there's more to politics and more to life. And it's a telling fact, I think, that Machiavelli says much less about the soul and much less about philosophy as a way of life than Plato does. Now those are just, I think, two facts that would be the beginning of a reflection about the difference rather than the end of the reflection. But I think it's a sign that there's a real difference in the concerns that the two authors are addressing.
Yeah, it definitely seems like Plato offers them a way to look at politics that they've never really even considered. Because I think everyone comes in being somewhat of an unwitting Machiavellian in interesting ways, and they never necessarily take seriously the claims that they see in Plato.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that's been interesting to me is I sense in the students that there's a range of students in the Hudson program that's very interesting for somebody teaching in it. I would say some of them are politically ambitious, and that's good and fine, and I think they may gravitate more immediately to Machiavelli. And I think some are more, you know, the theoretical or philosophic types, and they may gravitate more towards Plato. But I think what's interesting is that those two groups not just can talk to each other, but I think sometimes those who incline more immediately to Machiavelli can see something in Plato that maybe they hadn't appreciated before, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, to some extent, I don't want to go too far with this, but to some extent, the Machiavelli-Plato divide runs through the students in the program. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the very interesting things about the Hudson program, the way it's trying to combine the practical and the theoretical.
Right. Well, if you'd like to learn more about Plato or the Political Studies program, please check out our website. And if you'd like to study with Professor Devin Stauffer, definitely do apply to both Hudson Political Studies and the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.